Review of mode for ungrouped data. Welcome, everyone. Today, we are going to begin a review of the mode for ungrouped data. Now, as you know, when we dive into the study of statistics, we aren't just looking at a random pile of numbers. We are often searching for a single, meaningful value that can represent the center or the typical value of an entire data set. It's our way of summarizing information. Now, you are likely already familiar with the mean, which gives us that mathematical average we use so often. However, the mode offers us a different and very useful perspective. Instead of looking at a calculated average, the mode focuses on popularity or frequency, essentially telling us which value shows up most often. Over the next few slides, we will define this precisely and walk through a practical example to see it in action. Definition of mode. Now that we've established that we are looking for a way to find the center of our data, let's dive into the formal definition. First, the mode is defined as the value that appears most frequently in a given set of observations. To put that into simpler terms, if you are looking at a list of numbers, the mode is simply the number that occurs the maximum number of times. It's all about identifying which value shows up most often. Specifically, when we are dealing with what we call ungrouped data, which, as you'll see in our upcoming example, is just data listed individually rather than being sorted into ranges or intervals, the mode is simply the observation that has the highest frequency. So, keep an eye out for that highest count, because that's where your mode is hiding. In the next slide, I'll show you a step-by-step process on how to actually locate it. How to determine the mode. Now that we understand that the mode represents the most frequent value in our data, let's walk through the actual process of how to find it. I'll break this down into 4 clear steps. First, step 1 is to collect the data. This is simply the starting point where you gather all your individual observations or measurements that make up your data set. Next, step 2 is to organize the data. As you might have noticed from our previous slides, looking at a raw, messy list of numbers can be quite confusing and cluttered. To make things clearer, it is best practice to organize these observations into what we call a frequency distribution table. In this table, you'll create 2 columns. In the first column, you list each unique value found in your data, and in the second column, you record its frequency, which is just a fancy way of saying how many times that specific value appears. Once your table is ready, we move to step 3, which is to identify the maximum frequency. Here, you'll focus your attention specifically on that frequency column we just created. Your goal is to scan down that column and locate the highest numerical value present. Finally, we reach step 4, where we determine the mode. This is a crucial distinction to remember. Once you've found that highest frequency, you look back to the first column to find the observation that corresponds to it. That specific value, the one that repeats the most, is your mode. In the next few slides, we are going to apply these exact steps to a real-world example involving basketball shoe sizes to see this process in action. Real-world example. Now that we have covered the theoretical definition and the steps required to find the mode, let's put this into practice with a real-world scenario. Imagine a sports coach who is preparing to order new sneakers for 10 players on a basketball team. To ensure a good fit, the coach has gone around and recorded the shoe sizes of each player. The raw data we have collected is as follows: 8, 9, 10, 8, 11, 8, 10, 9, 8, and 12. At first glance, this list might look a bit disorganized, so in the next slide, we are going to learn how to structure this information to make the mode easy to identify. Step-by-step example. Now that we have our raw list of shoe sizes from the previous slide, the next logical step is to move away from that cluttered list and organize it. As I mentioned in our guide on how to determine the mode, step 1 is to organize the data into a frequency distribution table. Let's look at this table together. In the first column, we list our observations, which are the unique shoe sizes we found in our data. In the second column, we use tally marks to keep track of how many times each size appears. This helps us avoid losing our place. Finally, the third column gives us the frequency, which is simply the total count for each size. Looking at our table, for shoe size 8, we have 4 tally marks, giving us a frequency of 4. For size 9, we have 2 tally marks, so the frequency is 2. Similarly, for size 10, we see 2 tally marks, resulting in a frequency of 2. For size 11, there is just 1 tally mark, meaning a frequency of 1. And finally, for size 12, we also have a frequency of 1. By laying it out this way, the data becomes much clearer, and we are now perfectly positioned to move to the next step, identifying which of these frequencies is the highest. Identify the maximum frequency. Now that we have organized our data into the frequency distribution table on the previous slide, let's move on to the next step. We need to look specifically at the frequency column, which tells us how many times each shoe size appeared. If we list those values out, we have 4, 2, 2, 1, and 1. By comparing these numbers, we can clearly see that the maximum frequency is 4. Find the corresponding observation. Now that we have identified that the highest number in our frequency column is 4, we need to perform one final, crucial step. We look back at our frequency distribution table from the previous slide to see which specific shoe size that frequency of 4 actually belongs to. As you can see, the frequency of 4 corresponds directly to the shoe size of 8. This brings us to our final conclusion, where we can officially state the mode. Conclusion of example. So, to wrap up our worked example, we can clearly see our final result. Based on our frequency table, the mode of the shoe sizes is 8. To put this into a real-world context, this means that the most common shoe size among the players on this basketball team is size 8. It's important to remember that we aren't saying the frequency is 8, but rather that the value 8 itself is the one that appears most often. Now, let's take a moment to summarize the key takeaways from everything we've learned today. Key takeaways. All right, class, we have reached the end of our review, so let's take a moment to consolidate everything we have learned today. I want you to focus on these key takeaways to ensure you have a solid grasp of the concept. First, let's revisit the formal definition. The mode is simply the specific value that carries the maximum frequency within a data set. Now, you might ask, why do we use this instead of the mean? Well, the purpose of the mode is to identify the most popular or common value. While the mean gives us an average, the mode tells us which particular observation occurs most often, which is incredibly useful in real-world scenarios like the basketball shoe size example we just worked through. As for the method, remember that when we are dealing with ungrouped data, data that is listed individually, the process is straightforward. You are simply looking for the observation that repeats the most. Finally, I want to emphasize the importance of your process. To avoid errors and keep your work organized, a frequency distribution table is your most effective tool. It allows you to transform a cluttered list of raw numbers into a clear, structured format, making it much easier to spot that maximum frequency. Before we move on to our final slide, where I will highlight some common pitfalls to watch out for in your exams, make sure you have these 4 points clearly noted in your study guides. Common mistakes to avoid. First, please be careful not to confuse the frequency with the mode itself. This is a very common mistake. If we look back at our basketball team example, the highest frequency we found was 4. A student might mistakenly state that the mode is 4. But remember, the mode is the actual observation, in this case, the shoe size of 8, not the number of times it appeared. Always ask yourself, am I naming the value or just how often it occurs? Second, make sure you aren't ignoring any data points. When you are transitioning from raw data to your frequency distribution table, it is vital to account for every single observation. If you accidentally skip even one number from your original list, it could shift your frequency counts and completely change which value is identified as the mode. Finally, try not to assume that every dataset will have only one mode. While our examples today have been straightforward, keep in mind that if you encounter a situation where 2 different values share the exact same maximum frequency, the data is referred to as bimodal. So, Always double-check your frequency column to see if there is more than one value tied for the highest count. Now, before we wrap up today's lesson, I want to touch on some common pitfalls. Even when you understand the concept, it is very easy to make small errors that can lead to the wrong answer. If you keep these 3 points in mind, you'll be well on your way to mastering the mode for ungrouped data.